The night hung heavy over the forgotten archives, dust rising in faint columns where a single lantern flickered. Edward said, "The truth is buried in these walls, and I must unearth it." His voice trembled with obsession more than fear. The seeker of truth traced brittle scrolls, his eyes darting like a man haunted by phantoms of history. "Mary," said Edward, "the Taiping Rebellion is no puzzle for ordinary minds. It consumed millions. It can consume you too." Her tone carried caution, but it struck him like resistance. The shadows deepened as Edward whispered, "I am not afraid of ghosts, only of silence." The lantern hissed, smoke curling upward like a warning. Thomas stood at the entrance, reluctant and uneasy. He said, "If we are to follow you, at least tell us what you hope to find." Edward's stare was fire against the gloom. He muttered, "Answers that have been hidden for a century, answers that someone does not wish us to uncover." Outside, thunder rolled, as if the heavens themselves bore witness. A torn map revealed itself on the desk, lines of blood, red ink marking rivers and battles. Edward's fingers pressed down on Nanjing. He said, "This is where the truth begins." The room groaned with age, but it was the weight of destiny that pressed heavier still. The storm outside raged, yet Edward's thoughts burned hotter than the thunder. He said, "Every war hides more than it reveals, and the Taiping Rebellion hides the most of all." Mary tightened her shawl, muttering, "You risk drowning in riddles older than our time." Thomas crossed his arms, unwilling yet unable to step away. Edward leaned over the documents, sweat falling onto the parchment. He whispered, "History speaks through these pages, and I must hear it, even if it whispers blood." The air thickened with dust and dread, every corner alive with unseen watchers. The map became a battlefield in Edward's eyes, crimson lines alive with screams of the past. He said, "Nanjing was no capital of peace. It was a kingdom of fire." Mary flinched at his words, whispering, "Edward, you speak as if possessed." Thomas paced by the shelves, muttering, "Battles leave scars that no man should peel open." Yet Edward's hand did not tremble. He whispered, "Truth is scar, truth is wound, and I will open it wider." The lantern hissed again, and the storm outside answered like a chorus of ghosts. Mary pressed her hand against Edward's arm, her voice breaking. She said, "You will not find salvation here, only madness." Edward shook her off, muttering, "Madness is the keyhole to truth, and I am willing to look through." Thomas's sigh carried the weight of a reluctant witness. He whispered, "I should leave you to your obsession, but something tells me my fate is bound to yours." The room moaned under the storm, shelves creaking like bones stirred from slumber. The lantern sputtered, plunging the room into waves of light and dark. Edward said, "The rebellion was not just a war. It was a scripture, a revelation, and a curse." Mary stepped back, whispering, "And curses do not end when read. They begin anew." Thomas rubbed his temple, muttering, "Then we are already caught in its storm." Edward's voice carried finality. He said, "So be it, for storms are where truth is born." The thunder outside crashed like cannon fire, sealing their path forward. The night stretched into dawn as Edward's obsession deepened, his hands stained with ink and his mind consumed with fire. Edward said, "The rebellion was not a storm of men, it was a storm of belief." Mary hovered near him, eyes heavy with sleepless worry. She said, "You chase phantoms, Edward, and they will drag you where no living soul belongs." Edward's lips curved in a grim smile as he traced another passage. He whispered, "Every line here screams of secrets too powerful to remain hidden." Thomas leaned against the shelf, muttering, "Secrets are buried for a reason, and the earth itself resists their unearthing." Edward slammed the book shut, the sound like thunder trapped in wood. He said, "If knowledge is a weapon, then I will wield it, even if it destroys me." The lantern's flame flickered with his words, as if warning him of the abyss. Outside, dawn light pierced the storm, painting the room with pale resolve. Mary closed her eyes, whispering, "And if it destroys us too?" Silence answered her, heavier than the storm itself. Edward's obsession had turned the archive into a battlefield of pages, papers scattered like corpses of memory. He muttered, "These words are not history, they are prophecy." Mary clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles pale as bone. She said, "Prophecy written in blood cannot heal the living, Edward. It only wounds further." His eyes flared with a feverish gleam as he struck his hand upon the table. He shouted, "Then let the wounds open, for from wounds truth bleeds." Thomas grimaced, stepping closer. He said, "And what if the truth is poison? Will you still drink it?" Edward stared at him, unblinking, his silence more dangerous than fury. The storm outside had eased, but the storm within him had only grown. Shadows danced like soldiers across the shelves, whispering of war and faith. Edward exhaled, whispering, "If madness is the price, then madness shall be my guide." Mary turned away, unable to watch his descent. The air reeked of wax and sweat as Edward clutched a faded journal, his eyes devouring its secrets. He muttered, "Hong Shu Khan was not merely a rebel, he was a prophet crowned by delusion and flame." Mary whispered sharply, "Delusion crowns only the dead, Edward. Do not wear it yourself." Edward ignored her, flipping the pages faster, as if racing against invisible hands. Thomas shook his head, his voice low, "You stare too deeply into a well that has no bottom." Edward raised the journal high, declaring, "Every truth that terrifies is worth more than every comfort that soothes." The lantern guttered at his words, almost extinguished before returning in a trembling glow. Silence pressed around them, yet within Edward's chest thunder roared like cannon fire. His voice dropped to a whisper, "The rebellion lives again, and I will be its witness." Mary crossed herself in quiet dread. Morning light bled into the room, pale and cold. Edward sat hunched at the table, scribbling notes furiously. He muttered, "Every testimony is a riddle, every silence a scream." Mary, her patience thinning, said, "And what of us, Edward? We are not your riddles to be sacrificed." He looked at her as if she were a page to be read, not a woman of flesh and soul. Thomas stepped forward, his tone firm. He said, "You may be the seeker, but you are not the only one who bears the cost of seeking." Edward's pen snapped, ink splattering like blood across the page. His jaw clenched, his voice icy. He whispered, "I have no choice. Truth chooses me, not the other way around." The clock in the corner ticked louder, each second dragging them further into his obsession. Mary closed her eyes, tears pressing against the edges. By nightfall, the room had transformed into a shrine of madness. Maps, journals, and scrolls covered every surface. Edward stood at its center, his voice trembling. He said, "This is no longer study. This is revelation." Mary whispered, "And revelations destroy prophets as much as kings." Thomas circled the room, running his hand over the relics with a grimace. He muttered, "If this is revelation, it reeks more of tomb than temple." Edward lifted the lantern high, casting monstrous shadows. He whispered, "Then let this be my tomb, for here lies the truth unchained." Mary's face paled, her fear now soaked with sorrow. She said, "Edward, you are losing yourself." His reply came cold and steady, "No, I am finding the world as it truly was." The storm had passed outside, but the true storm had only just begun within. The library's silence was broken by the creak of doors opening, and into the dim chamber stepped Professor Liang, a figure of calm authority cloaked in danger. Edward narrowed his eyes. He said, "So the keeper arrives at last." Professor Liang's face betrayed nothing, his voice smooth. He said, "Truth is not yours to claim, Edward. It belongs to those who can protect it." Mary's breath caught as she whispered, "Protect it or imprison it." Liang turned to her, his gaze sharp as glass. He replied, "Secrets live longer in silence than they ever will in the mouths of dreamers." Thomas clenched his fists, muttering, "And who decides which dreams deserve silence?" Edward stepped forward, fire in his eyes. He said, "I have searched too long for you to tell me my pursuit ends here." The lantern glow carved the lines of obsession on his face, yet Liang's shadow stood taller, darker, as if the storm bowed to him. Professor Liang moved among the scrolls like a guardian, his fingers brushing parchment as if they were old wounds. He said, "Do you think the rebellion was merely a clash of armies? It was a scripture written in fire." Edward's voice rose with defiance. He said, "Scriptures demand to be read, not locked away." Liang's lips tightened, and his reply fell cold. He said, "And what if reading them burns the world anew?" Mary drew closer to Edward, whispering, "He knows more than he shows, Edward." Liang's eyes flickered, betraying a spark of hidden fear. Thomas muttered, "Fear makes even wise men hoard shadows." Edward pressed on, his voice trembling with determination. He said, "If the truth is flame, then I will walk through the fire." Liang stared at him, expression unreadable, and whispered, "And when you are ash, who will speak for you?" The silence pressed like stone. The map of Nanjing lay between them, like a battlefield of words. Edward said, "This city is the key, and you fear it." Liang shook his head slowly, murmuring, "I do not fear it. I respect its silence." Mary's voice trembled. "Silence is not respect, it is burial." Liang turned to her, eyes like steel. He said, "And graves are safer than mouths." Thomas spat his words bitterly. He said, "Safety is only fear dressed as wisdom." Edward struck the table, the parchment trembling beneath his hand. "Whoa!" he shouted, "the dead cry for us to listen, and I will not close my ears." Liang's shadow fell across the map as he leaned closer, his tone sharp. He said, "Then you will become one of them." The room shuddered with the thunder outside, as if history itself roared in judgment. The lantern sputtered, shadows shifting like ghosts around them. Liang's voice grew softer, yet each word struck like stone. He said, "You think knowledge makes you free, but it binds tighter than chains." Edward replied sharply, "Chains break when pulled hard enough." Liang's cold smile lingered. He whispered, "Until they cut through your flesh." Mary touched Edward's arm, begging, "Please listen to him. There is danger in what you chase." Edward shook her hand off, muttering, "Danger is the only path to truth." Thomas exhaled heavily, his words laced with dread. He said, "I've seen men die for less." Liang's gaze pierced Edward as he said, "Then be prepared to pay more than you can imagine." The storm howled beyond the walls, echoing his warning. As silence settled, the archive became a courtroom, the scrolls themselves serving as witnesses. Liang said, "Leave the past buried, and it will not consume the present." Edward's reply rang like a verdict. He said, "The past already consumes us. The rebellion bleeds through every silence." Mary's tears shimmered in lantern light as she whispered, "And we bleed with it." Thomas turned toward the door, voice grim. He said, "I came to watch, not to be buried with you." Edward's voice lowered but carried iron. He said, "Then watch as I break the seal of silence." Liang's calm cracked for the first time, his tone sharp. He said, "You know not what hunts those who open such doors." Thunder roared overhead, drowning his last word like a gavel. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy with damp silence. Edward pored over the map while Thomas lingered, torn between doubt and loyalty. Edward said, "This city will tell me what history cannot." Mary pressed his shoulder, whispering, "It will break you before it speaks." Thomas paced, his boots thudding against the creaking boards. He muttered, "You drag us into graves already dug." Edward turned sharply, his voice edged with fire. He said, "Then why are you still here, Thomas? Why not leave?" Thomas's eyes burned with conflict. He answered, "Because you won't stop, and someone must be here when you fall." Edward stared at him, silent but shaken. Mary's breath trembled as she murmured, "Then he is your anchor, even if unwilling." The room's silence thickened, every relic whispering judgment. The archive felt colder, as Thomas spoke with unusual weight. He said, "I've seen death follow obsession, Edward, and you wear it like a crown." Edward's reply was sharp. He said, "If obsession leads to truth, I will gladly wear it." Mary's voice cracked. She whispered, And what if it leads only to ruin? Thomas's shoulders sagged, his tone low. He said, I should walk away, yet something in me says your path is mine as well. Edward's eyes softened for a moment. He whispered, Then you are braver than I thought. Mary looked at Thomas with surprise, sorrow, and gratitude mingling. She muttered, You are the only reason he may yet live. The lantern flickered, casting their shadows together against the wall. Mary placed herself between the two men, her voice trembling. She said, If you both march into darkness, who will light the way back? Edward's tone hardened. He replied, There is no return once the door is opened. Thomas muttered bitterly, Then I'll carry a torch for the both of us. Edward's lips curved faintly, admiration flickering in his tired eyes. He said, You speak as though you do not fear the shadows. Thomas shook his head. He answered, I fear them, Edward. That is why I walk beside you, not behind. Mary lowered her gaze, whispering, And fear binds you together more than hope ever could. Their voices faded into the weight of silence, but their unity forged in unease was undeniable. The old clock struck, echoing like a hammer against the silence. Edward's pen scratched across parchment. He said, If I fail, these notes may be the only voice left. Thomas's jaw tightened. He muttered, I'll make sure you live to read them yourself. Edward raised his eyes, studying Thomas with new recognition. He whispered, You do not follow me, you guard me. Mary's voice quivered, And who guards him? Thomas turned to her, his voice steady. He said, No one guards the guard, but that is the burden I choose. Edward leaned back, exhaling with unease. He muttered, Then this burden is ours, and it will weigh us all. The lantern swayed, shadows bending like chains across the walls. The rain outside softened into mist, yet tension clung heavier than storm clouds. Edward stood before the shelves, his voice hollow but determined. He said, Every ally is tested, every bond strained. Thomas answered quietly, Then test me. But no, I will not break as easily as paper. Edward turned, his eyes softer, his words fragile. He whispered, I do not seek your loyalty, Thomas. I seek your truth. Thomas's jaw flexed, his silence deeper than words. Mary's tears glimmered in the faint light as she whispered, Your truths bind tighter than chains. The archive, once cold and vast, felt smaller, as though the walls themselves closed in to listen. Outside, the mist rolled like a shroud, sealing them in fate. The archive no longer felt like sanctuary. It was a trap of whispers and shifting shadows. Edward leaned over the map, muttering, Truth is close, I can feel its breath. Thomas stood near, unease etched in his posture. He said, Close truths often bite deeper than lies. Mary shifted uneasily, her eyes darting to the doorway. She whispered, We are not alone tonight. A figure appeared in the dim glow, Daniel, a supposed ally from Edward's past. He said smoothly, You still search for ashes of the dead, Edward. Edward froze, his voice cold. He replied, And you still walk among them, Daniel. Mary frowned, muttering, Something in his eyes hides more than words. Daniel smiled faintly, too calm for the storm outside. Thomas muttered under his breath, An ally who arrives in silence is no ally at all. Edward studied Daniel's face, searching for truth but finding polished lies. Edward said, You never appear without reason. What binds you here? Daniel replied with charm. He said, Old debts and older friendships. Mary's eyes narrowed, whispering, Friendships built on secrets crumble. Thomas moved closer, his stance protective. He muttered, I've known wolves wear kinder smiles. Daniel's smile widened. He said, And yet you stand beside one already, Thomas. Edward's jaw tightened, his voice low. He said, You know things you should not, Daniel. Why? Daniel stepped nearer, shadows stretching across the table. He whispered, Because I have walked where you now crawl. The words lingered like poison in the air. The map trembled beneath Edward's hand as Daniel leaned over it, his voice dripping with false authority. He said, You seek Nanjing? You seek death cloaked as revelation. Edward snapped. Then guide me, or step aside. Daniel's eyes gleamed. He replied, Perhaps I guide, perhaps I mislead. The difference is a matter of trust. Mary whispered, And trust is already broken. Thomas growled low. Say your purpose, Daniel, before I drag it from you. Daniel smirked, calm. He said, Purpose is a mirror, Thomas. You see only what you wish. Edward's voice trembled with anger. He muttered, Mirrors crack when struck hard enough. The room pulsed with unease, every word sharper than steel. The lantern hissed, throwing smoke as Daniel's voice softened into a whisper. He said, I know the keeper's secrets, Edward, but secrets bleed those who chase them. Edward stared hard, his words sharp. He said, Then you bleed first, not me. Mary gasped, clutching her shawl tighter. She whispered, Edward, his silence speaks louder than his words. Daniel chuckled faintly, shaking his head. He said, You mistrust me. Yet without me you drown in riddles. Thomas stepped between them, his tone heavy. He said, Better to drown in riddles than be strangled by lies. Edward's voice cut through, cold and steady. He said, Then speak truth now, Daniel, or be gone. Daniel's smile faltered, the first crack in his mask. Silence fell like judgment as Edward and Daniel locked eyes. Edward whispered, I see it now. You are no ally, only a deceiver. Daniel's voice sharpened. He said, And still you need me, Edward. Mary shook her head, whispering, Need is not trust. Thomas's hand hovered near his belt, tense. He muttered, Deceivers die by their own tongues. Edward's voice rang out like thunder. He said, You will guide me to the truth, but I will never call you brother again. Daniel's smile returned, darker than before. He said, And yet, brother, you follow. The storm outside returned, thunder echoing the betrayal that settled in the room. The night was still when the group uncovered a faded letter hidden beneath the floorboards. Edward whispered, It speaks of a family torn apart by the rebellion. Mary's hand trembled as she read, her voice breaking. She said, It tells of a daughter lost, vanished into the storm of war. Thomas leaned forward, his face grim. He muttered, A ghost made of ink and silence. Daniel smirked faintly from the shadows, whispering, Perhaps that ghost still lingers. Edward's eyes burned with sudden urgency. He said, This is no ghost. This is truth bleeding from the past. Mary closed the letter with shaking fingers. She said softly, It was written by a woman who never found her child. Silence thickened, heavier than the storm outside. Edward muttered, Then her grief is the key we have ignored. Mary's voice carried the grief of the letter. She said, She wrote of rivers filled with fire and songs of sorrow that would never be sung again. Edward stared at her, whispering, The rebellion swallowed children as it swallowed kingdoms. Thomas shook his head, his tone bitter. He said, War devours innocence first. Daniel leaned closer, smiling thinly. He muttered, Perhaps innocence was only ever an illusion. Mary looked at him with sudden fury. She said, Only those who lost nothing can speak so. Edward struck the table. He said, This lost child was no illusion. She is the wound history hides. The lantern sputtered, filling the room with wavering smoke. The silence after was heavier than thunder. Edward spread the letter on the table like a sacred text. He said, The daughter is the thread. Pull it, and the tapestry unravels. Thomas muttered, Or it strangles you as it unravels. Mary's eyes glistened. She whispered, Her absence is the chain linking every sorrow in this tale. Daniel's chuckle was soft but sharp. He said, And yet you search for bones lost to dust. Edward glared at him, snapping, Even dust carries the truth of fire. Mary's voice cracked. Perhaps she is the reason the rebellion began. Edward leaned closer to the parchment, muttering, Then she is the catalyst, the silent figure binding the storm. The air thickened with grief and revelation. The storm returned outside, shaking the glass panes as if echoing the letter's pain. Edward whispered, "This family's grief is more than tragedy, it is prophecy." Mary's lips trembled as she said, "The child is gone, yet her absence reshaped everything." Thomas's voice was low. He said, "Grief fuels war more than weapons ever could." Daniel smirked again. He said, "Perhaps the lost child never died. Perhaps she became something else." Edward slammed the letter flat, his eyes blazing. He shouted, "You twist sorrow into games, but sorrow is the truest scripture." Mary cried softly, "And prophecy written in grief consumes all who read it." The storm howled like mourning voices in the distance. The group sat in heavy silence, the letter between them like a wound they could not close. Edward muttered, "This child's absence is no footnote, it is the rebellion's heart." Mary whispered, "She is both victim and catalyst, the ghost who drives the living." Thomas rubbed his forehead, his tone weary. He said, "And we chase her shadow as if shadows grant answers." Daniel leaned in, his eyes sharp. He said, "Sometimes the shadow is more dangerous than the flame." Edward's voice carried finality. He said, "Then we follow her shadow, for it will lead us to the truth." Mary's tears glistened in the dim glow. She whispered, "And perhaps to ruin." The storm roared, sealing the weight of their choice. The archive silence cracked as Edward laid the letter across the map, his voice steady but haunted. He said, "This child is no ghost of history. She is the wound that reshaped kingdoms." Mary's eyes brimmed with sorrow as she whispered, "And wounds, when torn open, never heal clean." Thomas paced, his boots echoing. He muttered, "Then we chase not truth but scars." Daniel's smirk widened, his words sharp. He said, "Scars are the only truths that last." Edward glared, muttering, "You mock grief, yet you are bound to it like we are." Mary's hand shook as she touched the parchment. She said, "This is the final key. Her fate is the rebellion's secret." Thunder rolled outside, the storm heavier than before, as if time itself bent to the revelation. Edward's voice dropped low. He said, "The silence of her story is the loudest voice we've heard." The storm rattled the windows as Edward spoke, his tone carved in iron. He said, "The rebellion was not born of faith alone, but of grief so deep it bled nations." Mary whispered, "Then we are prisoners of a mother's loss." Thomas's jaw tightened. He muttered, "And soldiers of her shadow." Daniel's voice cut through like a knife. He said, "And yet none of you ask why her child vanished." Edward turned, his stare piercing. He said, "Because you already know, Daniel." Silence struck sharper than thunder. Mary gasped, realizing the truth buried in his words. She whispered, You were there." Thomas clenched his fists, rage in his voice. He said, "Then betrayal was in our midst from the beginning." Daniel's composure cracked for the first time. He said, "I walked with the rebels, yes, and I kept the child from those who sought her death." Edward's fury flared. He shouted, "You withheld the truth, twisted it until grief became weapon." Mary staggered back, whispering, "You chose silence over salvation." Daniel's tone sharpened. He said, "Her life was safer in shadow than under a crown of fire." Thomas growled, "And yet kingdoms burned while you played guardian." Edward slammed the table, voice like thunder. He said, "You are no guardian, Daniel. You are the deceiver who chained truth." The storm outside lashed harder, echoing their clash of words. The truth lay bare between them, fragile and violent. Edward said, "This lost child is not a victim, she is the rebellion itself." Mary's voice trembled. She whispered, "Then grief raised an army greater than any emperor." Thomas stepped forward, his voice low but fierce. He said, "Then the truth we seek is no treasure, but a curse." Daniel's expression hardened, his words sharp. He said, "Curse or not, it cannot be undone." Edward's stare burned with obsession. He replied, "If it cannot be undone, it must be revealed." Mary's tears fell silently, her whisper breaking the room. She said, "Then the truth will bury us as it buried them." Thunder cracked, splitting the night like judgment. The storm reached its peak as Edward raised the letter high, his voice echoing like judgment. He said, "This child's silence is the rebellion's scripture, and now it is ours to bear." Mary sobbed, whispering, "No scripture written in grief saves the living." Thomas muttered, "And no revelation leaves men unscarred." Daniel's smile returned, thin and dark. He said, "At last you understand, the truth is not freedom, but bondage." Edward's gaze hardened, his words final. He said, "Then let bondage speak, for silence is the greater crime." The lantern extinguished in the wind, leaving them in storm-lit darkness. The truth was revealed, and its weight fell upon them all.